when it comes to water, what are the main outcomes that the world needs to be focusing on, and how do we measure their success and in achieving that mission?
Sure. So first of all, I believe that it's not a coincidence that we have this massive water problem. I think the framing that we have provided from the economics profession, but especially from the practical side, has continued to see it either just as a sector, so water is a sector, or also with different types of national policies, but also the public policy side of things has ended up just tinkering on the edges. So I think one of the biggest changes we need is to confront this as a global problem that requires systemic action. It requires collective action in the sense that we really need a common good framing, which means an objective to tackle together, as opposed to how public goods are often talked about, where it's just a correction for something that one actor is not doing. A systemic problem also in the sense that a lot of the research that the commission is actually showing is that, you know, it's absolutely a collective problem in the sense that deforestation in one part of the world causes flooding in another part of the world, causes droughts in another part. So the hydrological cycle itself is global and requires that collective action. And so, you know, having systemic collective action requires new types of economics. And that's really what we're trying to argue here. And then that means that the design of the finance, the design of the policy, the design of the partnerships needs to change from what we currently have as a status quo.
Right. And so, yeah, I heard in another video you talking about this mission, that it was like when we landed people on the moon, we had this like clear mission. So what would be the mission statement here? Sort of what is that sort of clear mission that we all need to be working towards?
Well, first of all, we should remember what a mission approach is. And, you know, going to the moon was not just aerospace. It required changes, investment, innovation in areas as different as health, nutrition, materials, electronics, and software. And definitely the water mission, which is to protect the global hydrological cycle and to keep it in safe, you know, constraints. That then requires national, local, and regional kind of sub-missions, right? You can't kind of dictate to everyone, oh, this is the mission, and somehow assume that that's going to inspire action. So really looking at the intersectoral nature of the problem and asking, what does it mean for food systems? What does it mean for health systems? What does it mean for how we construct cities? What does it mean for how we look at sustainable land use and ecosystems transitions? What does it mean for biodiversity? All these are areas that people are currently working on, but the parts, you know, the sum of the parts is not greater than, you know, the whole. So a mission-oriented approach, the idea is that if you actually have a clear mission statement, then what does that mean for how all the different actors work together? You know, so again, on the way to the moon, we ended up with camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, again, software. These were all solutions to the big mission, but that had kind of 100 or thousands probably of homework problems that had to be solved along the way. So really what those homework problems are that then foster purpose orientation, this is really what we also want the report over the next kind of year to highlight. So the idea is that the work we're doing with the commissioners, but also speaking to experts globally, will then help us really also formulate what these many, many different homework problems are that have to be solved along the way to the final mission itself, which is, again, keeping the global hydrological cycle in safe boundaries, which it currently is not.
But what would you say are sort of the levels of governance that, you know, the most important for achieving these outcomes?
Well, one, because government is so important, is actually to create alignment between different levels of government. And that means local government, regional government, national government, but global governments. You can't have a nationalistic solution to this in the same way that we couldn't have a nationalistic solution to a global health pandemic, right? We ended up with 8 different vaccines with COVID-19, but we didn't vaccinate the world. So what does it mean to have a mission like global vaccination? What does it mean for intellectual property rights? What does it mean for the design of public-private partnerships? It's exactly this that we should be asking with this global water crisis. What does it mean for rights, not just intellectual property rights, but all the different rights and ownership structures? What does it mean for how different parts of the world actually work together instead of having water nationalism? You know, again, vaccine nationalism, water nationalism. But also, it's interesting that as a problem, and it's a problem that brings so many different sectors together, but also all the SDGs. I can't think of one sustainable development goal of the 17 that doesn't have a water component. Of course, there's the obvious ones around WASH. There's the obvious one about, you know, life below our oceans. But actually, if you think of gender parity, that's a hugely water relevant area, right? Because many young women, unfortunately, get raped as they go fetch water when they don't have access to it. So really, this is a question also in terms of governance, how it can be an all-of-government approach. It's not just for the department in a country that deals with water. It's just as much for the department that deals with health, with equity. If it requires new economic modeling, we need our treasuries, our finance ministries to be paying attention. So it requires an all-of-government approach.
And also you talk about these submissions, which I guess for me is sort of the opportunities that we have to really move the needle and make things go forward. And so what would you say are sort of the main opportunities that you see which are going to really move that needle in terms of the water mission?
Sure. I mean, we definitely need to scale up current innovations, and we shouldn't pretend that we don't have the innovations. They're simply not being scaled up, and they're not being, again, approached with that all of government and public-private kind of serious collaboration. So the first, we need to innovate in and scale solutions for storage systems of water. So we need to address water storage holistically. Water storage innovations open up massive opportunities for cross-sectoral collaboration. So across water supply, energy, agriculture, that can actually achieve sustainable development, for example, by preserving natural ecosystems that actually account for the vast bulk of water storage. So wetlands, glaciers, rivers. But also another example would be complementing them with hybrid storage, so urban sponges in China, flood channels, sand dams, and especially also to build the infrastructure that's needed and to finance that building, so of tanks, of dams, but dams in the right places, not the wrong places, of reservoirs. Second, we need to reduce the extraordinary leakage in water delivery systems today. So there's many developed countries where something like 40% of water is lost in the course of delivery due to aging infrastructure. We need to scale leakage technology innovation. So, for example, thermal imaging drones and satellite technology are increasingly adopted in some countries, but not scaled. Third, we need to innovate in agriculture, which is actually the biggest user of water today and a hugely inefficient user. So the technologies actually do exist, things like drip irrigation, precision agriculture, but we can make them affordable. They're currently not affordable, so it's not a surprise they're not being used. We need to spread them and help improve farmers' yields at the same time. Precision agriculture is actually an information and technology-driven system leading to transformation and advancements in agriculture, but that means that we actually then need that digital capacity, that IT capacity, that knowledge creation capacity linked with it. So it's not just agro, it's also digital. Fourth, and really important, is recycling industrial wastewater. We're currently not recycling the bulk of wastewater, and the runoff is often polluted. And that itself has large economic, social, health costs. Indeed, something like 80% of global wastewater is not adequately treated, while many regions suffer water scarcity. So you have this kind of irony, right, which shows us it's not actually a total scarcity problem, it's how we're mismanaging water. And wastewater reuse can minimize pressure on our freshwater resources. And if we scaled and normalized recycled wastewater as the primary resource for agriculture, industry, and even potable use, we could really focus on that problem as its own moonshot, coming back to the terms we were using before. Just quickly, we also have to, this is fifth type of mission area, to move early to ensure that the transition to a low carbon economy, in particular low emission energies, reduces rather than increases the pressure on water. This is hugely an issue right now if we think of the global electrification drive, where we need lithium, to put into electric cars, and yet lithium extraction in the countries that have it as a natural resource is incredibly water intensive. So this reminds us again that there's a systemic issue. What looks like a solution in one part of the economy is creating a problem in another. And lastly, desalination. And this is an area that's a bit more well known than the others, but it can really be a powerful solution for many regions experiencing severe droughts and water shortages.
And something I want to talk to you about as well, which I think is part of your work, is this the role of the public sector and the role of the private sector. So I think that you talk about the public sector sort of shaping the market in a way that sort of that creates the right incentives. So what are the incentives that the public sector can shape to create incentives for efficient water use?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that just the concept of incentives also is part of the problem. What we need is both direct and indirect policy. So indirect policies are often those incentives. They might be tax incentives, and we can definitely also use tax incentives to affect change. So, those companies that are actually investing in all those different types of changes I mentioned might be able to get tax reductions, for example, but that means really using tax to kind of tilt the playing field, reward those actions which we know are better for people and planet. So there's something also very important about how people are, at the interface of basically every form of water, and what does it mean to, again, bring a human rights approach that holds legal obligations to the private sector and the public sector, and how they work together around any of those mission areas that I talked about before. I do think that this ultra shareholder value model of corporate governance has not helped us. If we look at the problems being experienced in the UK with Thames Water, for example, this is about corporate governance. And I'm really hoping that the Commission will be bold in our recommendations about corporate governance. We need much more stakeholder value, less of an obsession with shareholder value, because we're talking about a good that is absolutely at the center of people's human rights in terms of having clean, affordable, accessible water. And it's going to be very hard to do that if the profit motive is what is kind of directing, solely the profit motive, what's directing companies. And that's, again, why it's important to have these other legal obligations that have to do with stakeholder value and human rights. And I think water is going to be the perfect example of where we can actually sandbox, if we want to use that word, these different public-private partnerships. I think it'll be important for us in the report to make comparisons with what we've learned in other sectors. If I think about the health sector, which has received huge amounts of public investment just in the United States, $42 billion a year is what the US government spends on health innovation, and somehow it's not embodied in the intellectual property rights, it's not embodying in the prices of the drugs. So, we end up allowing the private companies set the prices because we think that's the market model, but the market has benefited from that public investment. So the market itself is an outcome of how we govern business, of how we govern public, and how we govern their interrelationship. So we should stop talking about the market. We should say, what kind of market outcomes do we want, and how do you backtrack and actually organize those relationships between business and the public, and also civil society actors, in order to actually achieve the goal. Right. That's, again, why the mission-oriented approach, I think, is very important. It gets rid of that ideology of public or private, but also gets rid of this confusion, I think, of the market. The market is not business, and how we govern business determines on the kind of market outcomes we get. And I think we've also misgoverned many businesses.